A very good evening to you and welcome to the Bottom Line, a wrap of the business news of the day. And a new book is out. We'll be speaking tonight to an agricultural economist about the state of land reform and farming in South Africa, which brings us to the number of the day. Let's start with that, and it is 80.6%. And indeed, this is the percentage of land owned by white farmers. The stats are from May 2018. Now, the 2013 Land Act marginalized black South Africans by disallowing the ownership of land. Policies, of course, after that allowed white farmers to consolidate their holdings. This is the problem, the lack of transformation in agriculture and land holding, but the solutions have been elusive. Amidst frustration about land reform, government has given expropriation without compensation the green light. Well, Wandile Sihlobo is the Chief Economist at the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. He's also served as a member of President Cyril Ramaphosa's advisory panel on land. He's written a book called Finding Common Ground, which is a collection of previously written work. It's an anthology of his regular columns, or a harvest, as he says in the conclusion. Wandile Sihlobo joins us on the line now. Wandile, thank you so much. Thank you for keeping us informed with these regular columns, and I'm grateful for this anthology. I think it covers such a lot of so many things that people in cities like me just don't even begin to understand. Let's start with that figure of 80.6%, the last stat about land owned by white farmers. And of course, this is such a complex issue. But in your view, can you just simply try and explain why you think that figure has hardly budged for years?
Yeah, no, thanks for having me on, Francis, and also thanks for the feedback on the book. I mean, on the figure that you are raising, I think I would caution to say in South Africa we really don't have a good sense of how much land is sitting on. We know that the majority of the land is sitting on white farmers, but we don't really have a definite figure. That's why in a number of writings, even when you're delving in the book, we do propose the issue that at some point we need a comprehensive land audit in South Africa. But yes, we cannot move away to the sense that to say the patterns of ownership in the country, that still needs to be addressed, which is why land reform on its own at a macro level is essential. But obviously, South Africa has been struggling to find out to say what method of land reform should we be applying, which is why a number of these policies over the years you've had them being proposed.
So there is this mystery that you look at right in the beginning. Many black beneficiaries presumably take up land over 2 million hectares. Why is government not redistributing that land that it has? And in fact, since 2006, you say there's been almost no redistribution.
Yeah, that's one of the challenges, Francis, because 1994 and going on up until just before around about 2005, the government would buy the land on the redistribution angle, because you remember land reform, we're dealing with land tenure, we're dealing with tenure restitution and also on redistribution. On the redistribution side, the state from 2006 up until now, that's where there's been a problem, giving the beneficiaries short-term leases, which have starved them of capital, starved them of investments that actually go into making the land, the farms, and some of the other land patterns that they pretty much benefit on to be as productive. And obviously, it's still a little bit of having a lot of political issue of saying, why are people not really getting the land? You find all of the stories largely getting a sense that there was a sense at the time that some of the beneficiaries would have the land, and thereafter they've received that they will either sell the piece of the land, which now would mean that the expenditure on land reform will be growing, but the patterns of ownership will not really be moving in that way. So the changing on the policy on its own had an unintended consequence, because now not passing on the title deeds to people means that now that land can't be as productive as the previous owner that was sitting on that land. That could have been solved by perhaps maybe the state looking at what Namibia was doing and having first right of refusal when dealing with instances like that. And I think that has contributed to slowing the progress when it comes to agricultural transformation.
If we look at the blame game, so government blame for some of the delays in proper land reform, proper redistribution, but there's also been claims that farmers have been incredibly greedy. So when there was the willing buyer, willing seller, some when they knew their land was up for sale would suddenly hike prices. Can you just address that? Is there truth to that? Because you have looked at the approach between 1996 and 2006 and saying actually there was some success in that willing buyer, willing seller.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that the method on its own, willing buyer, willing seller, is problematic. But I think on the issue of pricing of the land, that there is something to be said there. I mean, if you listen to people in the legal fraternity, people like Advocate Tembeka Nlukai Toby, Bulelwa Mabasa of Workmen's Attorney, they raise this point where they're saying buying land, the state buying land wouldn't necessarily have been gone for the market value on its own. It should have looked at the issue of just and equitable, which is what the Constitution actually says it should be done. So I do think that when we go forward, you might see some of those points actually being more elevated, which I think that they make a little bit more sense than actually going on a full expropriation without compensation. I do think that those suggestions that have been raised could help us to move forward. But certainly the prices of land over that period did increase significantly.
All right, and lots more in your book, but I want to get to this before we let you go. I love that you look at women in farming, and let's go to the small holdings. You point out that 80% of Africa's agricultural production is produced by smallholder farmers, and women are very big players there. But in other senses, they're left out in agriculture. Why?
Yeah, I think, Francis, that is another important point, women and also young people. And fortunately, in a South African context, we've recognized that matter. And if you look now to the beneficiary selection criteria policy, which the department published at the start of this year, it begins to elevate the place for women. It begins to elevate the place for young people to say on the potential beneficiaries, when we're dealing with land reform, when we're dealing with agricultural support, these are some of the people that needs to be favored. So far, for example, if you look at the agricultural labor market in South Africa, women are still making about a third. But I do think that even on the ownership patterns, those things that we are seeing over the past, that needs to change and make sure that there is not only diversity in terms of race, but also diversity in terms of gender as well as age.
All right, very important issues. Thank you very much. And that book, if you'd like to find it, Finding Common Ground by agricultural economist Wandile Sihlobo.